In podcast 12, I spoke with Jeremy Helm. He's a family friend who has studied and practiced nonviolent communication for many years. The podcast will now begin. I have read your chapter that you wrote or typed up called Technological Design to Help Humanize Humanity. And I've listened to a talk that you did titled Communication at the Center on the Radical X Change YouTube channel. And I've kind of formulated most of my questions from these two sources, which were created by you. So um, you talked about shared humanity. Can you talk a little bit about
hmm
what that is? What is shared humanity? Maybe give an example or two. Um, yeah,
Like our shared humanity.
yeah,
Like
our shared.
it's a background that we have in common, and of course, how we've been in relationship with each other, um, kind of will set the stage for how accessible that is in any given moment. So, in some sense, well, let me see. Other words for this are human needs and values, and the essential part of this is that, in some sense, those are universal. We might speak different languages to indicate, point to that part of our own experience,
Mhm.
but the, the the sense is that we have so much in common, and uh, so what really stands out in some part is how the differences, but that commonality really it can I think in some sense the more it's present in terms of and when it's present there's more trust, there's more awareness of each other, so there's more ability for collaboration, and and specifically that trust, like if you know that uh, your needs matter to me, then you'll trust that if I'm going to go off and do this thing, you know, in some sense I'm going to have you with me in mind there. And the other part of that is that, well, of course, your needs are actually the same expression of that this shared this whole gestalt of life, where it's like, oh yeah, you're just another expression of me, and so how life is going for you matters to me. So that's kind of what I have in mind around our shared humanity, and the and I'm sure we'll talk more about the significance of having that actually present in the quality of our relationships.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah,
I think I'm we could I say then that you're saying that our
yeah.
shared humanity is kind of our shared kind of human needs, and then there may be some amount of differences in our needs, but in general, we have a similar human needs. Is that kind of
Well, the where the differences come in is how do we meet those needs,
okay?
right? Like in different cultures have totally different ways of celebrating, but in some sense, it meets a need for celebration and recognition and connection. But what that looks like will be a lot different. So it's what I'm pulling from here, just to make it explicit, is that the work of Marshall Rosenberg, who formulated something he called nonviolent communication, which
Hmm.
is nonviolence in the sense of like a soul force. This is how Gandhi used the phrase. And yeah, so what Marshall saw was that conflict happens only at the level of strategy. And of course, in some sense, when you look around, all you see is the strategies, because that strategies are observable, they're particular, and uh, but then behind that is the universality that who I'm seeing in my life are people doing the best they can to meet their needs. And of course, part of their needs are their needs that they value, and
Hmm.
needs and values are kind of a different cut at the same thing, different way to look at it. Where their values are, they value how well other people are empowered to live life and meet their needs.
Okay, so let's come to communication. You kind of mentioned how there's oppositional communication and then there's communication of listening for the needs of others. Um, with this kind of differentiation, how can
Mm-hmm.
we lean in towards listening for the needs when we're kind of in the midst of dealing with kind of oppositional communication? How do we, because it seems like we have no control over having another person lean into
Mm-hmm.
listening for our needs.
Yeah,
So we have to be the one that
totally.
starts for listening for their needs, right? If we're in the middle of oppositional composition communication, excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
isn't that correct? Like we have to start, or someone else has to come in and start listening for the needs.
Well,
Otherwise,
yeah, in some sense, I think the golden rule shows up here, as in, I want to treat others the way I'd like to be treated. If I'm not being treated that way, well, actually, my best access to kind of to struggle for that being treated the way I'd like to treat others is to treat others the way I'd like to be treated.
yeah.
So, you know, uh, I'm what's coming to mind is that a quote from Marshall, and the clarity of distinguishing this is why it comes back to mind. Where what I got when he was saying this is that, which is that it's only someone, it's real, like what's out there when someone else is upset with me or whatever else. If there's that opposition going on, political, social, interpersonal,
Mhm.
they're doing their best to advocate for their needs as they conceive them. And so my part in that is that I may have stimulated something, and maybe I was oppositional towards them as well. And I'll discover that, man, I actually didn't meet my own needs for living my values, my own needs for care, for um, for deepening relationship or just kindness when I said something that provoked them. And then, oh yeah, like, wow, I regret that. And then just that sort of
Totally. Yeah. Sometimes it
ground,
takes
like,
me a while
wow, like,
yeah. Yeah, it takes me a while also to like recognize sometimes that I'm in a kind of state of antagonism or I'm not in a
mm,
place of the heart, kind of like thinking of like being kind of more gentle or kind towards another.
mm-hmm.
Kind of, yeah.
Even as you say that,
Hmm.
I and I think this is something around the power of like sharing or admitting like that. Wow, like I've been listening to you like you're telling me I did something like I've been listening to you like I needed to protect myself from you.
Hmm.
You were, and then seeing that I can give up that orientation towards someone. And
Hmm.
as you were sharing that, how you've done that, I just
Hmm.
got this sense of like opening where like I can trust you more. Where it's
Yeah.
like a part of me relaxed, where it's like, you're willing to uh, make amends for something. It's this brings us back into this. We're all trying our best to meet our needs, as well as we can. And then, so much of that is learning about how much subtler the calling is, from our hearts about how we want to be with people.
Yeah, I think sometimes I'm just functioning to some degree unconsciously, and sometimes my unconscious tendencies are not to always have the needs of others in mind. It's just me, and sometimes my habitual tendencies is just to function in a way that's trying to maybe have fun, or it just is not always
Yeah.
with the concern of others in my heart. Yeah.
Well, and what I hear in that is, I'm actually, what stands out for me is that, it's great that we can function automatically in some sense, because
Yeah.
there's so many things in life to take care of that, what I might have my attention out here on some project, and I'm walking past someone who, my significant other, and she wants to show me something, and
Yeah.
I get that. Oh, I've, you know, I was somewhere else,
Hmm.
and and I can't, do everything or be aware of everything all at once. And when, a conflict is basically a symptom that there's more to receive in the kind of connective information that the world has for us to learn from.
Hmm. So there's it's it's important to be receptive uh when we've just important to be receptive, especially with others when we're in the presence of others. And yeah, I guess maybe we can function more consciously when we're alone. But yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think what I hear in that is that maybe there's less risk in
Uh-huh.
terms of inflicting harm on others. But
Yeah.
on the other side of that, all the all of culture has really come out of the interaction between people,
Hmm.
and ceremony and language itself is
Yeah.
the kind of matrix of the sort of mental telepathy we do with language. It's so I think there's harm that that in some sense happens because of an absence of each other in life.
So then perhaps it's great. It's good to try to make an effort to try to relate with others, to interact with others, and to get social to the degree one can to their own capacity. And
Yeah. I
but
mean,
yeah,
whatever you're most inspired by, whether it's a solo meditation retreat or a dance festival, I don't know. It's that's up for everyone's own internal guidance system to seek you know uh, deepening whatever their particular way of caring about them, the whole world. I think
yeah.
ultimately we bring all of life experiences into the present moment when we're trying to do something, and you know it often looks mundane, but of course that's what it looks like on an everyday scale.
Well said.
So just to recap, we were looking at what I think of as, in some sense, communication best practices,
Yes.
and and the other side of this are those environments for communication that we've made as a humanity. We've had speech, and that's been great, and then literacy came about, and we could communicate over time with more fidelity rather than just having to rely on memory or rehearsing tribal or ancestral stories. And of course, nowadays, I mean, look at us here.
Yeah.
I'm in a room
Zoom, zoom,
talking to
zoom.
someone. so so there's a specific, looking at, and it's been enormously powerful to have, in the 1500s, I think it was, when the Gutenberg press it came about and was shared. And you know and in modern times we have the transmission control protocol for communication online, and then came the World Wide Web. And if you recall HTML or HTTP, that
Hmm.
H in there stands for hypertext. And hypertext was a word coined by someone back in the 60s. And of course, it was in the early 90s when we had the World Wide Web. So, what I've uh, heard about first, maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago, or actually earlier than that. But for me, the significance of that there was other ways of designing this global space of literacy, th- that's become a big interest of mine in terms of looking at, if that had been different, then how would that have affected the kind of spaces that we have on the internet to communicate with each other? And so what I've wound up seeing is that the the environment that was outlined by the originator for the vision of hypertext. This was someone he was actually like a theater major. his parents were in film, and the first time he was familiar with like Hollywood effects and how storytelling works on the screen. But the
Mm-hmm.
first time he saw electronic text on a screen, he he had this. It opened up for him this whole field of, well, how would that work? Like if you had this, I think he speaks about computers as being experience machines that they can, as a general multimedia thing. And so his vision for hypertext uh, uses the freedom of movement in the design of like an electronic space of text. Actually, what he called his project was Project Xanadu, the magical place of literary memory, and it's much more artistic than saying the World Wide Web is the information superhighway or something like that. But what I'm going to say, complete my thought here. What I see is that space, the magical place of literary memory, Project Xanadu, is actually, as a playing field for communication, has a bias for feedback in a way where those communication best practices we started speaking about, where they could actually flourish in a way and become adopted in a way that I would say they haven't come about because sort of conflict and controversy and the attack and defend, those impulses are much faster than building trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's continued with politics and in the social sphere and cultural wars in a way that just, for me, it points to that we really need a different playing field where different values can come to the forefront.
Okay, so let me kind of try to summarize what I'm hearing, and then you can correct me
Right.
if I misunderstood you at all. So, uh, the kind of original vision for the for hypertext and its use, and then kind of communication in the World Wide Web, that you feel was more in alignment with kind of communication, of like best practices. For example, communication where we're not communicating from a place of conflict, but, but from a place of listening, for the needs of others. Whereas now, the way that the World Wide Web is currently designed and the different social media platforms that allow us to communicate with each other, it's designed in a way that's not necessarily uh, synced up with being able to kind of communicate, uh, using best practices and listening for the needs of others. Am I misunderstanding you, or am I
Yeah, you got the gist of it,
okay?
and it's I do want to highlight though that of course uh, it doesn't it happens at the level of like statistics.
Hmm.
There's a lot of people who they're creating great content which is has to do with connecting across differences, all this type of stuff. But what I'm trying to draw the attention to is what prevails. What is the and I look around and war is evident. Conflict is evident, and in the minds of the people who are animated by that in some sense, there it's they I guess when it came down to it, they might have wished that things could be different. But as far as I'm actively looking for a way that we could both understand each other newly. I don't see that's not in the culture in a more general way, and especially at the larger levels. It can be something, and this is where being born of embodied communication and having lived, and evolved in that setting, we have that kind of feedback in person where it's like, oh yes, my neighbor, like I want to be able to get along with this person. But when if it's someone further away, they're easier to villainize, right? And
Definitely.
so,
Yeah, if we're not really, I don't have an intimate way of communicating with them, then we can just fabricate all kinds of strange
yes.
mental projections and stories and narratives about who they are and what's wrong about them or something. Yeah, definitely.
So I
So
could say more about. Go ahead.
yeah,
I
so it sounds like you're not kind of taking the Jaron Lanier's approach of kind of let's abandon social media, but it's are you kind of implicating that let's refabricate social media or refabricate how we communicate with each other on the World Wide Web? Is that kind of your thinking process? Um, so that we can
yeah.
kind of implement best
So
practices but in a better way. Is that kind of what's going on in your mind?
well, I mean, there's different. Yeah, in my mind is one thing, and so
Yeah.
uh, where I'm at right now is how do I speak about these subjects so that I can have more conversations with other people about them, because it's something, I've had some conversations where people said, well, you need to learn how to code.
Mhm.
And,
Yeah, yeah,
for
yeah.
me to do that work at that level as well, I think we, what is that phrase? Teamwork, teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What I'm looking for what I see possible is that the communicative terrain, it could be shaped such. I'm making this complicated in my mind, um, because when feedback is present, you can't have people getting ahead or narratives getting ahead which make others wrong, because if so villainizing other people, those other people are equal participants in the conversation, and they would naturally provide feedback about, hey, you got this wrong about us, it's actually like this. And from this feedback, uh, that narrative would be, slowed down. It would in some sense turn from an attack into a request for empathy. And this is where I see these skills of listening as coming in handy, and actually badly needed everywhere, because I have this image of, if you can imagine, maybe a whole building of people playing, they're in different rooms, or they're in a larger building, they're on top of the roof, and they're all playing tug of war. And everyone, the blue team it looks like it's got the same number of people as the red team. And suppose we kind of paused this and looked at everyone's tug of war, and in some sense all that force would cancel each other out.
Okay. So kind of
Yeah.
what I'm as a summary of what I'm getting is people need to be aware of communicating in the form of best practices and communicating from the approach of listening for the needs of others, and that there's that not all communication is going to solve problems. That some communication is going to cause more conflict, and we need to approach communication from a standpoint of there's kind of basic human needs and shared humanity. And we got to keep that in mind when we're communicating with each other in order to kind of move towards harmony. And, you're talking about the
Well,
evolution of, yeah, go ahead.
I want to jump in right there, because I mean, my orientation towards that
Mhm.
is, and maybe this has come from the practice of it. I don't know, but it's much more like, I've learned to trust myself. That
Okay.
that it's not like there's anything that I have to remember. It's just that when there is when there's like a breakdown on something's not working, then it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I I I have a sense of where to go, where to put my attention when there is that breakdown, where I tell a joke, and you know it's not funny for the other person, or like, I've offended
Yes.
them. Then
Yeah.
it's like, oh, okay, okay, I don't have to avoid that, or and so like, oh, how was that for you? Did or and I might even have a guess about like the sensitivity to whatever it is, where I then get interested. That's where my attention will go to. I'll get interested in like, oh, what's alive for you in that, and then it's like, and then like, oh my god, they might have had an experience where it's like, that's too soon, or whatever it is. And that, there's practices that, what I see these practices as doing is just helping people come back into resonance or alignment, or whatever you want to call it. And I think we're at a set, like children are very good at this in some sense, in terms of like being aware of the internal, this, and actually feeling out how this reciprocity works is so much of what happens in development. And unfortunately, I don't think I'm getting any more succinct while speaking to you. So,
But you don't worry, it doesn't have to be.
yeah,
Sometimes moving in different tangents can just kind of proliferate or express the
totally.
different information that needs to be expressed, and things don't always have to be so cohesive. It's okay.
So in San Francisco, there's a place called Lightning Labs, and what they do is they've built a secondary layer on top of Bitcoin. And look, stepping back about, what even is Bitcoin? Like, you can get a technical description of it,
Yes.
but well, what is it for? Like, like, what is the function? What is it supposed to be? What's the vision there? There's all sorts of questions there. And so, one of the key things is decentralization. So that, as a value of decentralization, is what that's pushing for, is the separating money from state. So right now, the Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve, they
Mhm.
decide how much money, like what the monetary policy is that we're going to operate inside of. There's like 12 people who do that. So here, that comes out of all sorts of political history and so forth, and looking at what they could design and what the trade-offs were. Well, now through Satoshi Nakamoto designing something which, in some sense, takes it out of everyone's hands and says, like, okay, this is the monetary policy. There's, no one can actually disrupt this. That's the decentralization element. So it's something where no one has a competitive advantage, in and of the protocol itself. There'll be people who have, they like work in the oil industry, or whatever else, whatever the position is. But in terms of, does anyone have any influence, outside outsized, greater than others influence of this because of how it's designed? And so that's sort of like, not really. So uh, right now we're kind of still in the area of like a broadcast social reality. What the president says, what the commentators say, what everyone who's being informed by these things. But what I see possible online is that there's a consensual reality, a participatory medium of conversations, where I can jump in and I can comment on the president's speech. And then if people are seeing this, the importance of that bit of what could be called missing information about what's going on, then that, because so if whenever someone's looking at this, like what the president said or whatever, there's this whole conversation around, contextualizing that statement. So if someone wants to lead, they've really got to be able to speak to all the, like, they need to understand people at this deeper level than that actually unifies them, and speak from what comes from that deeper place. Because and if someone said, provides feedback to that speech, and they actually have missed what was being said, it's an opportunity to clarify. And so these types of back and forths, where someone will come to this conversation, say this thing, and then that allows for a deepening of what's actually intended. These are the kind of dynamics that you don't need a trusted third party like the Federal Reserve involved. You don't need to have moderation saying, like, this is just bad, like, we can't have this here, or like, this isn't what reasonable people think. It all comes out of the interaction in the medium itself. So this is one of the reasons why I mentioned Bitcoin, because they have a very clear value around decentralization, and actually, in some sense, creating a shared reality around how do we want monetary policy to be. Well, someone said, hey, no one should have control over this. And this is the interesting thing about Satoshi, where like they started it and then they left. It's got an anonymous founder, and so that in some senses no one and everyone at once. So that's the kind of thing I'd want to see when they came up with the technical innovation to create this thing that then no one could alter. So having a space where uh, you can't buy advertisement and have that show up in front of something useful that someone is sharing for less, or whatever else it's the kind of it's really in the spirit of how you would treat a loved one, that kind of generosity. That probably needs more explaining as well, but
Yeah,
thanks
so
for hearing
what
me.
I'm hearing is like if we're gonna have leaders, then obviously sometimes they're gonna be missing certain things and not uh having everybody in mind, but they want to try to be implementing these best practices as well, and thinking about the shared humanity of the people they're leading and the needs of the
Mm-hmm.
people they're leading. But then, maybe we're evolving as a species and as societies, we can move more and more away from centralized forms of leadership and to more
Yeah.
decentralized, and one of the stepping stones of getting there is putting these best practices into practice. Am I missing it, or?
Yeah. Well, in some sense, Jesus was out there to share the best practices, right? Any spiritual leader, they're talking about these type of things
Yeah.
of really of supporting people in reimagining and seeing newly who we are and who we could be for each other. And when it comes to the contemporary world, right? So the office of the presidency is older than the telegraph,
Hmm.
right? So having a figurehead, having this centralization and authority,
Hmm.
uh, preceded, that was the pony days, that was the Pony Express days,
Yeah.
that and then now there's ways of, so the Constitution didn't have a way, any this will be rewritten in whatever most connective, communicative environment is then available, because they were so early in that curve where that wasn't part of their thinking. And it took a while even to recognize any people, every person as a person. So it was not by no means a perfect process. And so one of the things overlooked was, how do we have a more de- uh, and with it being decentralized, it's actually, how do we bring more wisdom into what we're doing?
Yeah.
That's
At all
that's
levels, in the form of our communication, in the form of updating our leadership and how that looks for our each of and every one of our particular societies and groups that we find ourselves in. But yeah, it sounds like education as well. And one thing that I
sure.
really, before we started this chat, that kept coming to my mind again and again, is something I really struggle with when it comes to communication, especially when it comes to conflict-ridden communication, is patience. Like, it seems like from my perspective, maybe I'm missing something, but it seems like patience is a very integral component to maybe it's one of the practices in the best practices to just
Sure.
getting to.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't know. I don't know.
Well,
Uh,
what I'm hearing, so patience is one way of distinguishing it. Um,
mhm.
Another way is like, how
Yeah.
do I be with
Yeah.
what this other person has to say to me? Where it's like, if I'm, you can kind of tell when, if someone is coming at you or something, whether or not they're like, they're getting pissed off and
Yeah,
all this
yeah.
stuff. It's like, how do I actually just stay present and receive, you know not at like a any specific level, but it just is the whole thing, where it's like, who I'm being is, actually how, and it really shows up in how you occur for me.
Yeah.
So, like when I can tell and this is actually an insight that my father had, that he told me, like, Jeremy, from that last marriage, what I realized is that when I'm being impatient, I'm not actually being loving. Like, and so
Yeah.
just getting this, like, oh,
Ouch. Yeah,
here's my
that's yeah.
significant other, and I'm thinking things with him where it's like it's testing my patience. You know, for me, that's one of those signs of, like, okay, like, what am I actually committed to? Like, oh, first off, it's like I could just acknowledge, man, it's hard for me to be here right now, the way that she's occurring for me. Like, oh yeah, just recognize for myself that I'm struggling a bit here, and it's like, okay, and then I've checked in with myself, turning back to them. It's like just even being curious now, instead of like, I think I know who they are and what they're doing. Like, maybe I could be curious, and then all of a sudden, I see them in a new way that I've never actually considered before, or it's just like, oh yeah, no, she's advocating for this thing that's been important to her, and yeah, I haven't really fully heard her out on that yet. So how about now, I'm just gonna bring forth my attention, and and this so much, it just kind of reminds me of that, that risk of, it's a risk. So much more is possible when there's more of us involved in a conversation, and unless we're you know immersing ourselves in, really trying out, and that's kind of what I'm doing here with you, is like, man, I don't know how well I'm going to speak on these subjects, but I guess
Yeah.
the opportunity, I'm and right now I'm like really grateful that you invited me. So it's like, yeah,
You've touched on a lot of good things, and interesting things and things to think about. And also I just want to say how that when you were touching on how in the attempt to be aware of how we are, you know, perceiving our significant others,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
uh, it's important to be able to coming back to your father's realization. It's important to be able to check ourselves before we wreck ourselves and be like, you know, may like
Well,
do am I being really curious right now? Am I being open-minded to how I'm perceiving this person? Or am I kind of unconsciously projecting a certain perception on this person that's not really helping to move things
yeah,
in a more
I'm
harmonious direction?
you
Like
know
I
I,
think that's really important for me particularly to think
yeah,
about. I don't know if that will hit home for anyone else, but yeah.
well, I think we're always projecting something,
Yeah.
and whether or not that actually is an invitation
Hmm.
to the other person, I guess in some sense it could be a dance or a fight. I think
Yeah.
you're upset, so I'm going to punch you, and then of course you see now, the way I want to dance with you is actually, a fight. But or I could see your fist flying forward as an invitation to swing around. I'm thinking of
To do some
Tai Chi here.
jujitsu. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, the
Totally.
redirection of force, where it's like, and in some sense, that ethos of jujitsu and Tai Chi, of ending the fight.
Yeah.
you know it's and of course those guys appear to fight all the time, but they're practicing, so they're in that practice of, how can I engage with this person, and practice the craft.
Yeah. It's like an art form of making the
Mm.
best of what's being thrown at you.
And so perception itself is an art. I see this in your art actually as well, where there's such a friendly, loving world that comes out in your depictions of people.
Hmm.
It's
Thank you.
soft, gentle, playful, colorful, very imaginative.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. That I think coming back to the beginning of our conversation in the last recording, there's certain times when we're functioning unconsciously. And when I'm functioning unconsciously, I'm probably much less likely to be aware of my projections. So that awareness is very connected to how we artfully project our perception on life, on others. So there's so many best practices that need to be implemented, and the just being receptive. Yeah, yeah. Thank you
Well,
for all these important
you're welcome.
reminders and things to think about.
I I really get your commitment to be mindful about these things. And I would trust you to notice when there's something for you to shift. And in the meantime, have fun.
Thanks. Have fun. I wish you have fun too. It's important to have fun. Thank you, Jeremy, so much for taking the time to share some of your ideas. Thank you. I hope you have a nice night. Thank you again for jumping on and having this talk with me. Until next time, please take good care. Yeah, thank you again. Bye-bye. Thank you for your time. Take good care.